The smokehouse door had swollen in the August heat, and it took both her hands to pull it open. She had known it would. She had known it every summer for 7 years, watching her husband throw his shoulder into that same warped frame each time he needed to check the fire, each time he needed to turn the racks or feed another length of oak into the pit below. She had meant to mention the swelling to him before the season began. She had not. There were 100 things left unmentioned between them now, and the door was merely the first she had come upon this morning. The hound pressed closer against her leg as the darkness opened up before them. He was old, gray along the jaw and above both eyes, moving with the careful economy of an animal that had learned to spend itself wisely. And he did not enter the smokehouse the way he once had, bounding in ahead of his master to investigate. He simply stood beside her, his shoulder warm against her knee, and waited. She waited too. The smell that came out was not decay. She registered this before she registered anything else, the way her grandfather had taught her to lead with the nose before the eyes, or the hands. "Let the air speak first," he had said, "and it will tell you whether you need to step forward or step back." She stepped forward. Inside, the light came in thin and gray through the gaps in the cured board walls, falling in long parallels across the 12 barrels stacked and ranked along the far wall. 8 of catfish, 4 of trout. Her husband had loaded the last of them 9 days ago, the morning before the river took him, working in the dark before the heat had risen because that was how he preferred to work, quietly, early, ahead of whatever was coming. She had not been inside since. The barrels sat with the patience of things that do not know they are waiting. She stood before them and thought of her brother-in-law, who had come to the house the evening after the burial, not the morning, not in the full sight of the town, but the evening when she was tired, and the boy from the landing was still sitting at her table, and she had not yet found a place to put her hands that felt right. He had come with his hat in both hands, and his voice lowered in what passed for sympathy, and he had said the word spoiled 3 times, before she had understood that he had not come to offer comfort at all. The heat, he had said, the extra days in the smokehouse while everyone was occupied with the river search. These things ruin a cure, he had said, as though she did not know what a cure was. His words had gone into her the way a splinter does, not deeply, but in a place she could not help returning to. She put her hand into her apron pocket and found the hickory rod by feel. Then she moved toward the first barrel. The first barrel was older than the others by the width of its stave rings. Its wood darkened to the color of river mud at low water. She did not open it yet. She stood before it with her hand resting on the lid and let herself go backward, the way the river sometimes runs a small current against its own main body, turning in a slower circle near the bank. Her grandfather had worked the big riverboats out of Memphis for 11 years before the work wore his knees past use, and he had brought nothing home from those years except his voice, his patience, and a set of 7 hickory rods of graduated thickness that he kept rolled in oilcloth at the bottom of a cedar chest. She had watched him unroll that cloth before every curing season the way another man might open a Bible. Not with ceremony, exactly, with recognition. He had showed her the brine reading first, because he said it was the foundation, and without it, everything else was guesswork, dressed up as knowledge. The rod went in at the center, not the edge, because the edge lied. The edge was always cooler, always denser, always more willing to show you what you wanted to see. The center told the truth. She had learned to read the resistance of brine against hickory, the way she later learned to read weather, not by any single sign, but by the weight and quality of everything at once. He had showed her the salt bloom on stave wood, too, how a good cure left a particular white crystalline line along the interior seam, neither too heavy nor too faint. Too heavy meant the brine had worked too fast and driven the salt through the flesh before the smoke had finished its own work. Too faint meant the cure had stalled somewhere in the middle, and the middle was where spoilage liked to begin. The right bloom was even, patient-looking. He had said it looked the way a hard frost looks on a window glass before the sun reaches it. She had been 12 years old and had not understood, and then she had been 14 and had understood completely. The smell he had saved for last, because, he told her, smell was the most honest sense a person owned, and also the most easily frightened. You had to approach it slowly. You did not put your nose to the barrel and draw deep. You opened the lid, you stepped back 1/2 step, and you waited for the smell to come to you in its own order. The first layer was always salt and wood. The second was the smoke itself, oak or hickory or whatever had been used, still present in the flesh after weeks. The third layer, if the cure had held, was the fish. Not rot, not rawness, but something that had been transformed into a different thing entirely. That third layer was what you were waiting for. She crossed to the corner of the smokehouse, where the cedar chest sat beneath a piece of canvas. The dog followed and lay down beside it without being asked. She lifted the canvas and opened the chest, and there were the rods, still rolled in their oilcloth. She unrolled the oilcloth on the cedar chest's lid and counted the rods by touch before she looked at them. 7 in total, each one a different length, each smoothed by years of handling until the hickory had taken on the color of old honey. She selected the middle rod, the one her grandfather had called the general rod, the one you reached for first, when you did not yet know what you were dealing with, and slid it into her apron pocket alongside the small ledger she had brought from the house. The ledger was her husband's, half filled with his own careful entries, dates, barrel numbers, wood used, weight of salt per gallon. His handwriting was small and deliberate, the letters formed as though each one required a separate decision. She had not looked at it since the funeral. She looked at it now, found the last entry, barrel 12, oak, late August, trout, and turned to the next blank page. She went to the first barrel. It stood nearest the smokehouse door, which was where he always placed the catfish barrels, and the iron hoop at its crown had a small notch filed into it that she recognized as his marking system, his way of keeping the catfish separate from the trout without needing to label them in writing. She set her palm against the wood. The stave was dry on the outside, which was what it should be. Wet staves meant the seal had wept. These had not. She pried the lid with the flat iron bar she'd brought, working it slowly around the circumference, not forcing it, letting the seal give in its own time. The dog rose from where he had settled and came to stand beside her, not urgently, simply present, his gray muzzle just below the barrel's rim. She stepped back 1/2 step. She waited. The first layer came, salt and wood, clean and sharp. Then the oak, deeper, almost sweet, the long smoke still folded into itself. She stood with her hands at her sides and her eyes on the middle distance, and she waited for the third layer. It came, not rot, not rawness, something that had been fish and was now something else, something that had been worked on and completed, a smell that had arrived at the end of a long process and knew it. Her grandfather had never found a word for it that satisfied him. He had called it settled, finally, because that was the closest he could get. She stepped forward. The brine was dark amber, clear to the bottom, the surface unbroken by any film of gray or white. She lowered the rod slowly until the tip touched the surface, then pressed it down through the brine until she felt the first resistance of flesh. She held it there, counting the pressure against her fingers. Firm. Even. The flesh did not give too easily and did not resist too hard. Both of those would have told her something she did not want to know. She withdrew the rod, blotted it on the cloth she'd brought, and opened the ledger. Barrel 1, catfish. Brine, amber, clear. Surface, unbroken. Resistance, firm and even. She did not allow herself to exhale with any particular feeling. There were 11 more barrels. She moved to the second barrel. The dog had settled himself at the smokehouse threshold, his broad, gray head resting on his forepaws, his eyes tracking her as she worked. He had done this since the first morning, positioned himself in the doorway as though standing watch over something that required it. She had stopped noticing, the way one stops noticing a good fence. Its presence was simply part of what kept things in order. She lifted the second lid with the same deliberate motion, the same interval of waiting. The smell that rose was a near twin of the first, oak and salt, and that deep-settled quality her grandfather had named for its ending rather than its character. The brine read amber in the slant of light through the door. She lowered the rod. The resistance was firm. She recorded it in the ledger without flourish. Barrel 2. Catfish. Brine. Amber. Clear. Surface. Unbroken. Resistance. Firm and even. She was fitting the lid back into place when she heard the gate. She did not need to look to know the sound of his step, heavier on the left foot than the right, a habit carried since boyhood, she supposed, or perhaps longer. He came with another man beside him, someone whose boots she did not recognize from the rhythm of them, someone who walked with the careful, measured tread of a man, composing himself for an audience. The brother-in-law did not enter the smokehouse. He stopped at the open door, close enough that the dog lifted his head and held it there without rising. He said what he had come to say at a volume designed not for her, but for the fence line, where a neighbor's wagon had slowed on the road. He said the heat had been unconscionable this August. He said a man of his acquaintance, the merchant at his elbow who nodded, had seen other cures go wrong in lesser temperatures than this summer had produced. He said that every day she delayed moving those barrels to the river was another day of liability accruing against the property, against the note, against any reasonable settlement he might otherwise be prepared to offer. His voice carried the practiced tone of a man who had rehearsed the speech until it sounded like reluctance. She listened. She finished setting the lid in place. She picked up her ledger. Then she looked at him, not with heat, not with anything that could be called a challenge, and said that she was still taking inventory, that she expected to be some time yet, and that she would be grateful if the door remained unobstructed while she worked. She said it the way her grandfather had said most things worth saying, once, evenly, without decoration. The brother-in-law drew breath as if to continue. The merchant beside him did not quite look at either of them. She turned back to the third barrel. After a moment, she heard the gate again. The dog watched them go down the road until they were past the bend. Then he lowered his head back to his forepaws. She lifted the third lid. The third barrel held catfish. 8 of them, she counted, laid in careful alternating rows, the way her husband had always packed them, spine to belly, belly to spine, so that no 2 fish pressed their cut faces together and drew moisture where moisture would ruin. She worked the tasting rod down along the side of the topmost layer, feeling for resistance. The flesh gave only slightly. then held, a small, firm push back against the hickory that meant the cell walls had closed properly around the salt. She withdrew the rod and brought it to her nose. Oak smoke and brine, and underneath both, something she had not been expecting. A thread of sweetness, faint as the memory of a thing rather than the thing itself. She stood with the rod held just beneath her nose for a long moment. Her grandfather had described it once, sitting on the lower deck of the Annabelle Marie, while the river ran brown and wide around them. A late summer evening with the gnats thick in the air above the waterline. He had been turning a piece of cured buffalo in his hands, the way other men turned a coin, and he had said that a proper long cure developed a sweetness in the smoke smell that had no right to be there by any logic of salt and fire, but that was how you knew. Not by the salt, not by the color of the flesh, not even by the resistance, by that thread of sweetness underneath everything else, which meant the smoke had gone all the way through and begun, as he put it, to settle in. She had been 9 years old. She had not thought about it in 25 years. She wrote it in the ledger. 3rd barrel, catfish, 8 count. Flesh resistance firm and consistent. Brine depth unchanged from prior. Sweetness present in smoke smell, faint but clear. She underlined sweetness once, not from drama, but because she wanted to remember it precisely. The 4th barrel was catfish again, packed by a different hand. Or perhaps the same hand on a different day, because the rows were slightly less even, the alternation less strict. Her husband's work late in a long season, when the tiredness got into a man's precision before it got into his judgment. She did not mind. The tasting rod read the same. The sweetness was there again, perhaps marginally stronger, the way a note held slightly longer becomes, without effort, more certain of itself. She made her notes. The dog shifted in the doorway, turned twice in a slow circle, and settled again. The 5th barrel was trout, the first of the 4, and she lifted its lid with a care that was almost ceremonial, though she would not have called it that. Trout was more delicate than catfish, in both flesh and temperament. A cure that held catfish could still fail trout if the smoke had run uneven, or the salt had crusted at the surface without drawing through. She dipped the rod. The rod told her what she needed to know before her hands did. The brine level in the 5th barrel sat exactly where it should, neither sunken with evaporation nor clouded with the gray murk that signaled a cure gone wrong at the root. She pressed the hickory tip slowly through the surface and felt the slight, clean resistance of fish packed well, the flesh neither giving too easily nor holding with the stiff defensiveness of oversalted meat. She withdrew the rod and held it to the fading light coming in from the smokehouse door. The brine that clung to it was pale amber, the color of creek water over limestone in August, and it caught the last of the afternoon sun the way good things sometimes do, without asking for notice. She wrote 5th trout, brine color, clear amber, rod resistance correct, surface firm. Then she set down the pencil and did something she had not yet done through the first 5 barrels. She cut a sliver. It was a thin piece, no longer than her thumbnail, taken from a fillet near the upper layer where the smoke would have penetrated deepest. She used the small knife she kept in her other apron pocket, wiped the blade on her sleeve first, from habit, and brought the sliver to her mouth while still standing over the barrel. The flavor stopped her completely. She had expected confirmation, the competent, reliable taste of a cure done correctly, the kind of result that would satisfy a ledger and quiet a brother-in-law and hold up before a harbor master. She had not expected this. The smoke was there, as it always was, oak deep and unhurried, But beneath it, something else had had time to develop. A sweetness that was not sweetness exactly, more like the memory of the river itself, cool and faintly mineral, the way air smells just before a summer rain. The extra week had done what an extra week sometimes does to a thing that is already good. It had made it truer. She stood very still for a moment. Then she walked to the smokehouse step and sat down in the cooling dark, and the hound came to her immediately, the way old dogs do when they understand, without being told that stillness means something important is happening. She let him put his gray muzzle across her knee, and she kept her hand on his back without moving. Her husband had built a good smokehouse. He had chosen the oak himself, had tended the fire carefully through the long season, had packed these barrels with the particular patience of a man who loved the work more than he ever said out loud. He had not lived to see what his patience made. She understood, sitting there in the dark, with the hound breathing slowly beneath her palm, that what he had left behind was better than anything he had produced before. It was the finest thing. The thought arrived as grief and arrived as pride, both at once, neither canceling the other. She sat with it until the dark was full. Then she went inside and closed the ledger. The neighbor woman came at first light, the way women do when they carry news. They are not sure how to give, quietly and with something baked under her arm as a reason for the visit. She sat at the table and spoke without looking up from her hands, and the widow listened without interrupting. Word had moved down to the dock, as word always moved in a river town, faster than boats, slower than shame. The harbor master had said nothing aloud, but he had asked twice whether the barrels had been moved from the smokehouse yet, which was the way a careful man registered curiosity without committing to it. The two merchants on the east end of the wharf had been more plainly cautious. One had told a buyer to hold off on looking elsewhere for smoked fish until the question was settled. The other had said nothing, which in a town this size meant the same thing. They were waiting to see which way the current ran. And then there was the brother-in-law. He had been seen that morning at the creditor's office on the corner of the main street. The one with the green door, the neighbor woman said, as though the door's color mattered, though perhaps it did, the way small details do in places where everyone tracks movement and inference. He had been inside for some time. He had come out looking neither pleased nor troubled, which was, the neighbor woman felt, the most troubling expression of all. The widow thanked her for the cornbread and walked her to the door. She did not say anything about what she intended. She was not built for declarations. She went back inside and put on her apron. By the time the sun had cleared the tree line east of the homestead, she was already at the fourth barrel. The hound moved with her in his slow, arthritic way, settling a few feet off each time she stopped, watching her hands with the attentive patience of an old animal who has learned that his person's work is worth attending to. The fourth barrel held catfish, packed tight as the first three, the brine sitting high and clear. She worked the hickory rod down along the inner wall, turned it slowly, drew it back. The resistance was even. The surface of the brine held its color, pale amber, faintly gold where the light crossed it, and the salt crystals along the rim were the particular flat white that meant the moisture exchange had completed cleanly. She pressed the flat of her wrist to the barrel's outer stave. Cool. Steady. She moved to the fifth, then the sixth, then the seventh, which was the last of the catfish barrels. Each one confirmed what the previous three had confirmed, and what the first had told her most plainly, that the slow oak fire and the extra week had done their work without interruption, and the work had held. She recorded the findings in the margin of the ledger. Then she lifted her eyes toward the river, where the dock was already beginning its morning noise. She moved to the 8th barrel and found it as the others had been. The brine clear, the salt rim properly crystallized, the flesh beneath the rod firm and giving back in the way her grandfather had described as the fish telling you it is ready, not the fish telling you it is tired. She recorded the result in the ledger margin with the same small, careful notation she had used for the 7 before it, and the hound settled his chin against her boot as she did, his breath slow and even in the morning air. Then she pulled the 8th barrel to the side and stood before the 9th. It was the last of the catfish barrels. She knew it by the maker's mark her husband had scratched into the stave end, a shallow double cut, his habit from his father, and she rested one hand on the lid before prying it. The wood was cool. There was no swelling in the stave, no seam weep, no smell that arrived before it should. She worked the lid free with steady hands and set it against the smokehouse wall. The rod went in along the inner wall, the same slow rotation she had made 8 times already. And then she felt it. Not rot, not failure, but a softness, a slight give beneath the rod's pressure near the lower seam on the south-facing stave, where the brine would have pooled as the barrel was moved and resettled. A pocket of uneven cure, no larger than a man's palm, where the salt had not penetrated with the same completeness. The flesh there had not spoiled. She probed it twice more to be certain, working the rod carefully. But it was softer than it ought to be, softer than the rest of the barrel, and softer than she would sell at full confidence, without noting it plainly. She straightened. She looked at the barrel for a long moment. The hound had raised his head. She did not re-examine the barrel a third time, nor did she move it away from the rest, and tell herself the problem was smaller than the rod had said. She uncapped the ledger, turned to the margin, where 8 clean notations already stood in her handwriting, and she wrote the truth of the 9th barrel in the same deliberate strokes. Seam soft, south stave, lower third, brine settled uneven, set apart. Do not represent as equal. She lifted the barrel by its rolled edge and moved it to the far wall, apart from the others, and set it down there without ceremony. The hound watched her do it. There was something clarifying in the act. Not comfort exactly, but the particular steadiness that comes from having accounted for a thing honestly, when accounting for it honestly cost you something. 8 catfish barrels stood confirmed and unqualified. One stood separate, honestly marked, and the ledger held both facts without apology. She turned to face the remaining row. 4 barrels had stood here when she began. Now 3 remained, and each one held trout, and each one was still unopened. She lifted the hickory rod and moved toward the first. The first of the 3 trout barrels opened before the morning light had fully settled, the river still gray outside the smokehouse door. The hound curled near the threshold with his chin on his forepaws and one eye half open. She worked the lid with the same measured pressure she had applied to every barrel before it. No urgency, no dread. And when the oak peg came free and the cloth lifted, the smell that rose was clean and cold and faintly sweet, the way oak smoke becomes something almost floral when it has been given enough time and the salt has done its work without interruption. She inserted the hickory rod. The flesh yielded the way good cured trout should yield, with resistance first, then a clean, even give, no softness beneath the surface, no hollow pocket where moisture had pooled and sat. She drew the rod back and examined the brine line on the wood, the level, the color, the faint, crystalline rim where the salt had gathered at the surface. And then she stood in the early stillness and thought about what she was reading, the way her grandfather had taught her to think before she wrote anything down. "The rod does not lie," he had said, "but a person can misread a rod." So you think before you write, she thought. Then she wrote, "Clean cure, even resistance, brine level correct, crystalline salt ring present, confirm." The second barrel took longer to open, the peg having swollen slightly in the humidity, and she worked it loose without forcing it, knowing that forcing a swollen peg was how a lid cracked and a barrel lost its seal. When it came free, the smell was deeper, darker, richer, the second week of curing having drawn the oak further into the flesh than the first barrel's lighter notes. And she thought of the river in late summer, how it went still and dark in certain bends, where the current slowed and gathered itself. The rod confirmed what the smell had told her. She wrote the notation. The third barrel she opened last, the sky outside the smokehouse door gone from gray to pale gold. By then, the hound awake and watching her, with the particular attention he gave to things he did not fully understand, but trusted anyway. This barrel was the finest of the three. The brine line was precise, the crystalline ring thick and unbroken, the flesh beneath the rod firm all the way to the bone. She held the rod in the light a moment longer than necessary, reading it, and then set it back in her apron pocket, without ceremony. She resealed each barrel in turn. Fresh brine-soaked cloth pressed smooth, oak pegs tapped flush. The way her grandfather had shown her a fish was prepared for a long journey rather than a short sail. The ledger held 11 confirmed barrels and one set apart, honestly marked. She closed it, smoothed the cover with her palm, and set it on the shelf beside the lamp. She heard the whistle before she saw the smoke. It came low across the water, a single long note, the kind a riverboat gave not in greeting but in navigation, announcing itself to the bends ahead. She was at the smokehouse door, checking the oak peg on the 11th barrel, when the sound reached her, and she went still in the way she had learned to go still when something required full attention. The hound lifted his gray head. His ears moved forward. She had not expected a boat until the following morning. The schedule posted at the harbor master's office had said as much, and she had planned her morning accordingly. One more pass through the ledger, a final tasting of the separated barrel, and then the walk to the dock in the afternoon when the light was right and the heat had broken. But the river kept its own accounting. She tucked the ledger under her arm, checked that the hickory rod was seated in her apron pocket, and walked to the door. The harbor master was already on the dock when she came down the path, standing with a man she did not recognize, broad-shouldered, unhurried in his movements, wearing the kind of coat that had been good quality once and had since become simply functional. He had a riverman's posture, weight-centered, accustomed to shifting decks, and he was looking at the water rather than at the dock as the harbor master spoke to him. She could not hear the words from where she stood, but she saw the harbor master turn and point, not toward the general landing, not toward the provision shed, but directly at the smokehouse. At her. The captain looked where he was directed. His gaze was level, assessing, the automatic appraisal of a man who had provisioned for long hauls, long enough to read a dock in a single pass. He took her measure the way she had taken the measure of the barrels, without hurry and without pretense. She walked toward him. The hound moved with her, square at her left side, his pace matching hers, exactly the way it had matched her husband's before her, as though the animal understood that what came next required a witness. She stopped at the foot of the dock, one step from the planking, and waited. The captain came to her rather than requiring her to come to him, which she noted. He glanced at the hound, then at the ledger under her arm, then at her face. "He tells me," the captain said, with a brief inclination of his head toward the harbor master, "that you have smoked fish, catfish, and trout." 12 barrels, she said. 11 confirmed, 1 separated and marked honestly. He studied her for a moment, the way a man studies a current he is about to enter. "I'd like to see them," he said. She led him to the barrels. They were arranged along the dock wall, in the order she had opened them, the confirmed 11 standing together, with their lids replaced and marked in her husband's chalk shorthand. C for catfish, T for trout. A small check beside each that she had added herself as she worked through them over the preceding days. The 12th stood apart, its lid weighted with a flat stone, its marking a single careful asterisk. The captain walked the row without touching anything, reading her chalk marks the way he might read channel posts on an unfamiliar stretch of river. The hound sat down at the end of the row and did not move. She selected the 4th barrel, a trout barrel, the one she had opened on the 3rd morning, its brine a clean amber, its salt crystals forming exactly as her grandfather had described, like frost on still water. She had returned to it twice since, not because she doubted it, but because it was the one that had most clearly confirmed everything she needed to know. She pulled the lid. The captain did not lean in immediately. He stood with his hands at his sides and let the smell come to him, which was itself a kind of knowledge, the smoke and salt and the deeper sweetness of oak-cured flesh that had had the time it needed. Then he pressed one thumb into the surface of the top fillet, testing the resistance of the flesh, the way meat answers pressure when the cure has gone all the way through. He held the pressure for 3 seconds, released it. The flesh held its shape. He took a sliver from the edge with his pocket knife and put it in his mouth. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the harbor master shifted his weight somewhere behind them, long enough that she heard the hound exhale slowly against the dock planking. Then the captain said, "Show me the ledger." She opened it to the page where she had recorded each barrel's opening date, its brine reading, its flesh assessment, the cure duration. He read it with his forefinger tracing the lines, not quickly. She explained the extended cure without apology, the additional week, the reason for it, the way the slow oak fire had continued its work beyond her husband's original schedule. She showed him the 12th barrel, opened its lid herself, and told him what she had found there. Soft flesh in the lower third, the brine slightly off, the cure incomplete. She priced it separately and honestly, less than half. He moved to 3 more barrels in sequence, 2 catfish, 1 trout, and examined each with the same unhurried thumb pressure and the same close attention to brine color. He did not taste again. He did not need to. When he finished, he replaced the last lid himself and turned to face her. "Double rate," he said, "for the 11, half for the 12th." She did not hesitate. "Agreed," she said, and the word was quiet and level, the same as every other word she had spoken on that dock. The harbor master produced the ledger of transaction. The captain's man brought the strongbox from the wheelhouse. She watched the coins counted onto the dock's rough surface, not into her palm yet, but in plain sight of every man standing there, the stack accumulating with the slow and indifferent logic of arithmetic. The 2 merchants had drawn closer without appearing to, the way men do when something is being settled that they want later to say they witnessed. Behind them, at the far edge of the small crowd that had gathered as crowds do near moving money, her brother-in-law stood with his arms folded and his face composed into an expression she recognized. A man waiting for a reversal that was not coming. He had arrived expecting a different scene. He had perhaps expected the captain to recoil at the smell, or to find the dark color of a long cure unfamiliar, or to defer to the more forceful voice of a man who held a debt note and spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed. What he had found instead was a woman with a ledger, a hickory rod, and 11 barrels of smoked fish that a riverman of 30 years' experience had just agreed to carry upriver at double rate. There was no argument available to him that the moment had not already answered. The fish were plainly sound. The property was plainly solvent. The debt note in his pocket had been rendered a document about money, nothing more, and the money now existed. When the coins were counted into her hand, the captain's man counting aloud, one denomination at a time, deliberately, she did not look at her brother-in-law. She looked at the coins. She felt their weight, which was the weight of the smokehouse and the homestead, and the late summer and the long weeks she had spent alone with the barrels and the old hound and what her grandfather had taught her. She folded her hand around them and placed them in her apron pocket, beside the hickory rod. Her brother-in-law left without a word. She did not watch him go. She thanked the captain plainly and without excess. He nodded once, already half-turned toward the work of loading. The harbor master signed the ledger. The merchants moved off. The dock returned to its ordinary business. She picked up the hickory rod and walked back along the river path, the old hound falling into step at her heel, the way he always had, gray-muzzled and unhurried, his nails quiet on the packed earth. The water moved beside them in the late afternoon light, the same as it always had. The smokehouse waited at the end of the path, still smelling of oak. Her husband had built it well. She had always known that